I guarded a grave for 30 years. Last night it opened. I need to tell someone this. I need to say it out loud, or write it down, or do something to make it real, because right now, sitting in my kitchen at 4 in the morning with every light in the house burning, I am not entirely sure that the last 3 decades of my life actually happened. My name is Thomas Mercer. I am 62 years old. And until last night, I was the guardian of a grave. Let me start at the beginning. Not last night. Not the hand. The beginning. I was 32 when the letter arrived. That's important to understand the age I was, the state I was in. 32 and falling apart. My marriage had ended 7 months prior, not with a bang but with that particular kind of whimper where you come home to find half the furniture missing and a post-it note on the refrigerator. Sarah had taken the couch, the good dishes, and whatever remaining dignity I'd been clinging to. The post-it said, "I'm sorry. You'll understand eventually." I never did. My career was not going much better. I was a journalist, or I had been, once, when that word still meant something to people. By 1996, I was freelancing for regional papers that paid 40 cents a word and took 3 months to cut the check. My last published piece had been a 1,200-word feature on a county fair pie eating contest. The editor had cut it to 400 words and misspelled my name. So when I found the envelope on my doorstep that October morning, I was in no position to be picky. It was heavy. Cream-colored stock, the kind of paper that costs more per sheet than I was earning per article. No return address. No postmark, which I noticed but chose not to think about. The flap was sealed with dark red wax, pressed with an insignia I didn't recognize, something circular, geometric, like overlapping rings or perhaps a coiled serpent. I couldn't quite make it out, and when I tried to examine the impression after breaking the seal, the wax crumbled to dust between my fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was meticulous, each letter formed with the kind of precision that suggested either a very old person or a very patient one. It read, "Mr. Mercer. We understand you are seeking employment. We have a position that may suit your temperament. The work is simple. You will guard a gravestone at Greenvale Cemetery, 4 nights per week, from sundown to sunrise. Compensation will be considerable. If you are interested, call the number below." That was all. No company name. No explanation of what considerable meant. No indication of why a gravestone would need guarding, or from whom, or what I was supposed to do if someone actually tried to disturb it. I should have thrown it away. Any rational person would have. But rationality is a luxury of the comfortable, and I was 3 weeks from missing rent. So I called. The number connected after a single ring. There was no greeting, no recorded message, no hold music. Just static, the deep, oceanic kind, like holding a seashell to your ear, if the ocean it contained were somehow wrong. Vast and close at the same time. And beneath the static, breathing. Not labored. Not threatening. Just present. The way you might breathe if you had been breathing for a very, very long time and had gotten extraordinarily good at it. Slow. Measured. Each inhale lasting perhaps 5 seconds, each exhale the same. I listened to 3 full cycles before I spoke. "I'm calling about the job," I said. The breathing didn't change. The static shifted slightly, as if the connection were adjusting to accommodate my voice. "I accept," I said. I don't know why I said that. I hadn't heard the terms. I didn't know the pay. I hadn't even confirmed I was speaking to a person. But the words came out of my mouth with a certainty that didn't feel entirely my own, and the moment I said them, the line went dead. The second letter arrived the next morning. Same envelope. Same wax seal. This time, the instructions were detailed. I was to report to Greenvale Cemetery at sundown, 4 nights per week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. I was to sit beside the designated gravestone. The letter included a small, hand-drawn map marking its location in the northeast corner of the grounds and remain there until sunrise. I was not to leave the gravestone unattended for any reason. I was not to attempt to read the inscription. I was not to dig. I was not to invite anyone else to the cemetery. I was not to discuss my employment with anyone. The pay would be deposited weekly. The letter did not say where. At the bottom, in slightly smaller handwriting, as if added as an afterthought, "You will not be harmed. What you guard cannot harm you, as long as it remains beneath the ground." Greenvale Cemetery sits on a low hill about 12 miles outside of town, at the end of a gravel road that the county stopped maintaining sometime around the Carter administration. The cemetery itself hasn't accepted new residents since the 1940s. The iron gate at the entrance is permanently ajar, frozen in place by rust and the slow, patient work of ivy. The stones inside are mostly weathered beyond reading, names and dates dissolved by a century of rain into smooth, gray anonymity. I arrived at my first shift on a Tuesday evening in late October. The sun was setting behind the tree line, casting the kind of long, amber light that makes everything look like a faded photograph. I parked my car on the gravel shoulder and walked through the gate, the map from the letter held in my trembling hands. The northeast corner of Greenvale is the oldest section. The stones there are smaller, rougher, many of them no more than irregular chunks of granite sunk halfway into the earth. Moss covers everything in that corner: the stones, the ground, even the lower branches of the oaks that ring the perimeter like dark sentinels. The air smelled of wet earth and decomposition, but the clean kind, the kind that speaks of leaves and wood returning to the soil rather than anything more disturbing. I found the gravestone easily. It stood apart from the others, not because it was larger or more ornate, but because of the space around it. The other graves in that section were crowded together, their stones leaning against each other like tired commuters on a subway. But this one had a clearing, a perfect circle of bare earth roughly 10 feet in diameter, as if the ground itself had decided to give this particular grave a wide berth. No grass grew in that circle. No weeds. No moss. Just dark, packed dirt that looked almost polished. The stone itself was modest. Gray granite, perhaps 2 feet tall, weathered but not crumbling. Most of the inscription had been worn away by time and weather. I could make out a B near the top, perhaps the beginning of a name, and an R lower down, possibly a surname or the start of one. The only fully legible text was a partial date, 1872. Whether that was birth or death, I couldn't say. I remembered the instruction: do not attempt to read the inscription. I sat down on the bare earth beside the stone, my back against a neighboring oak, and waited for something to happen. Nothing happened. The sun went down. The temperature dropped. An owl called from somewhere in the tree line, that hollow, descending note that sounds like a question no one wants answered. The moon rose, nearly full, and cast the cemetery in that particular shade of silver blue that makes everything look like it's underwater. The shadows of the gravestones stretched across the ground like dark fingers reaching toward me, then past me, then slowly retracting as the moon climbed higher. I sat there for 11 hours. Nothing happened. At sunrise, I stood up, brushed the dirt from my jeans, and drove home. On my kitchen counter, I found an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $3,000. For one night's work. In 1996. I didn't question it. I didn't hesitate. I went back the next night, and the night after that. And For the next 30 years, that was my life. 4 nights a week. Sundown to sunrise. Sitting beside a grave in a forgotten cemetery, listening to the owls and the wind and the particular quality of silence that exists only in places where the living have no business being. Let me tell you about that silence. It's important, because it's the thing I miss most, which I understand is a strange thing to say about a graveyard. But Greenvale's silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of something else, a deep, almost physical stillness that settled over the cemetery like a blanket. You could feel it on your skin. It pressed against your eardrums. It filled the space between your thoughts. After a few weeks, I stopped bringing a radio. After a few months, I stopped wanting one. The silence became a companion, as real and as constant as the gravestone itself. I brought books. Hundreds of them, over the years. I read by flashlight at first, then by lantern, then by one of those little clip-on LED lights that they started selling in the early 2000s. I read everything. Novels, histories, biographies, philosophy. I read the complete works of Dickens sitting beside that grave. All of Tolstoy. All of Hemingway. I made my way through the entirety of the Western literary canon, one dead author at a time, surrounded by the actual dead. There's an irony there that wasn't lost on me. The years passed. They passed the way years do when your life has a fixed routine, quickly, and without you noticing. The world outside Greenvale changed. The internet happened. Then smartphones. Then social media. I watched it all from a distance, the way you might watch a parade from a high window, aware of the noise and color, but fundamentally separate from it. My body changed too. My hair went gray, then white. My knees started to ache on cold nights. I developed a slight tremor in my left hand that made holding books difficult. I turned 40 in that cemetery, then 50, then 60. I aged in the company of the dead, and the dead didn't care, and somehow that was comforting. The pain never stopped. Every week, an envelope on my kitchen counter. The amount increased over time, adjusted for inflation, I assumed, though I never asked, and there was no one to ask. By the time I reached my 50s, the checks were for $8,000 a week. I had more money than I knew what to do with. I bought a modest house, paid off the mortgage in 3 years, and invested the rest. I was, by any reasonable measure, wealthy. All for sitting beside a rock in the dark. People sometimes ask me, well, no one asks me, because I never told anyone. But I've imagined the question often enough, didn't you get scared? Didn't you wonder? Didn't you, in 30 years, ever feel afraid? The answer is complicated. In the early years, yes. Every shadow was a threat. Every snapping twig was a footstep. Every gust of wind that moved the branches above me was something reaching down. I would sit rigid against my tree, my flashlight clutched like a weapon, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain whatever was in the ground could hear it. But fear, like everything else, erodes with time. By year 5, I was comfortable. By year 10, I was at peace. The cemetery became my office, my sanctuary, my church. I knew every stone by shape. I knew where the foxes denayed in winter, where the owls nested in spring. I knew the particular way the moonlight hit the granite at different times of year, blue-white in January, warm gold in September. I knew the sounds, the distant highway, the creek that ran along the western boundary, the specific creak of the iron gate when the wind hit it just right. I knew the gravestone too. Intimately, the way you know a friend's face. Every crack, every patch of lichen, every subtle shift in color as it aged. I never tried to read the inscription, I honored that rule, but I knew the shapes of those visible letters by heart. The B, strong and upright. the R slightly tilted, as if leaning away from something. The 1872, each numeral cut deep into the stone with a precision that suggested either great skill or great urgency. I talked to it sometimes. To the stone, or to whatever was beneath it. Not words of substance, just the idle chatter of a lonely man. I'd read passages aloud from whatever book I was working through, or describe the weather, or talk about the news. I know how that sounds. But when you spend 30 years in the company of a single object, you develop a relationship with it whether you intend to or not. And here is the thing I have never admitted to anyone, the thing I am admitting now because after last night, secrets seem pointless. I loved it. I loved the work. I loved the silence and the stars and the slow, gentle rhythm of the seasons turning over the cemetery like pages in a book. I loved the sense of purpose, the knowledge that I was doing something important, even if I didn't understand what it was or why. I was a guardian. I had a post. In a life that had been marked by failure and drift, that simple fact that I had been chosen, that I was trusted meant more to me than I can express. There were strange things, over the years. I won't pretend there weren't. Small things, easily dismissed individually, but forming a pattern that I chose not to examine too closely. The temperature around the gravestone was always slightly different from the rest of the cemetery. Warmer in winter, cooler in summer, as if the ground were regulating itself. On very cold nights, I could see a faint mist rising from the dirt around the stone, not steam, exactly, but something thinner, more deliberate, like breath. The circle of bare earth never changed. In 30 years, not a single blade of grass encroached on that 10-foot radius. I watched seeds blow across it in the fall, watched rain soak into it in spring, and the dirt remained bare and dark and smooth. Once, in a fit of curiosity, I pushed a small stone into the circle. The next night, it was gone. Not moved, gone. Animals avoided the area. The foxes, the deer, the raccoons that wandered through the cemetery at night, they all gave the northeast corner a wide berth. The owls would land on any tree in the cemetery except the oaks that ringed that clearing. Even the insects seemed reluctant. On summer nights, when the rest of the grounds hummed with crickets and cicadas, the area around the gravestone was silent. And sometimes, on the very stillest nights, when the air was heavy and the moon was hidden behind clouds and the world felt like it was holding its breath, I could hear something beneath the ground. Not movement. Not knocking or scratching or any of the things you might expect. It was more like resonance. A low, subsonic vibration that I felt more than heard, rising up through the packed earth and into my bones where I sat. It was rhythmic. Regular. Like breathing. Like the breathing I had heard on the phone 30 years ago. I never mentioned this in the reports I didn't write, to the employer I never saw. There were no reports. There was no employer, not in any conventional sense. Just the letters, the checks, and the silence between them. I tried, in the early years, to investigate. I searched public records for the ownership of Greenvale Cemetery. I found a chain of holding companies that led to other holding companies that led to a post office box in a town I couldn't find on any map. I tried calling the phone number from the original letter. Disconnected. I visited the county recorder's office and asked about burial records from the 1870s. They had none for Greenvale. As far as the official records were concerned, the cemetery had never existed. I stopped investigating. The pay was too good and the questions were too uncomfortable. The years accumulated. I grew old in service to a mystery I had stopped trying to solve. I developed routines. I had a specific route through the cemetery: enter the gate, follow the central path past the Civil War section, cut through the row of unmarked stones, approach the northeast corner from the south. I had a specific spot where I sat, always the same oak, always with my back against the trunk, always facing the gravestone. I had a specific way of settling in for the night: thermos of coffee, book, flashlight, the old wool blanket I'd brought since the first winter. I was comfortable. I was at peace. I should not have been at peace. Because whatever arrangement had been made, whatever compact existed between my unseen employer and whatever lay beneath that gravestone, it was not permanent. It was not a containment. It was a delay. And delays, by their nature, end. Last night was a Tuesday. April. The weather had been strange all week, unseasonably warm, with a heaviness in the air that felt like the atmosphere was bracing for something. The sky was overcast, the moon visible only as a pale smear behind the clouds. There was no wind. The cemetery was utterly still. I arrived at sundown, as always. Walked my usual route. Settled into my usual spot. Poured my coffee, opened my book. I was halfway through a collection of Borges stories, which in retrospect seems almost too appropriate, and began to read. The first hour passed normally. The second. The third. It was just past midnight when I noticed the temperature change. Not the usual subtle regulation. This was sudden and extreme. The air around the gravestone dropped, I would estimate, 20 degrees in less than a minute. My breath plumed. The coffee in my thermos went from warm to ice cold. I could feel the chill radiating from the ground beneath me, seeping up through the wool blanket and into my spine. I set my book down. I looked at the gravestone. It was the same as it had always been. Gray granite, 2 feet tall, those familiar letters, B.R. 1872. Nothing had changed. But the ground had. The packed dirt within the circle, that perfect, bare, 10-foot radius, was moving. Not dramatically. Not like an earthquake or a sinkhole. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a gentle undulation that I might have dismissed as a trick of the light if I hadn't been staring at that same patch of earth 4 nights a week for 3 decades. The dirt was rising and falling. Slowly. Rhythmically. Breathing. The ground was breathing. I stood up. My knees cracked. My left hand was trembling, and not from the cold. I took a step back from the circle's edge, my flashlight beam playing across the surface of the dirt, and I watched the undulation grow stronger. The rises were higher now. The falls were deeper. I could see the earth cracking along faint lines, like the surface of a dried lake bed, and from those cracks came that same thin mist I'd seen on cold nights, but thicker now, more substantial, rising in pale tendrils that curled and twisted in the windless air. The smell hit me next. Not decay, or not exactly decay. Something older. Something that had gone past decay and come out the other side into a kind of concentrated essence of earth and time and darkness. It was the smell of deep caves. Of sealed tombs. Of places where the air has been still for so long that it has forgotten what movement is. The gravestone shifted. Just slightly. Just a fraction of an inch. But I saw it tilt, the way a tooth loosens before it falls, and the sound it made, a low, grinding scrape of stone against packed earth, was the loudest thing I had heard in that cemetery in 30 years. I should have run then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. But I had spent 30 years as this grave's guardian, and guardians do not flee. I stood my ground, flashlight shaking in my trembling hand, and I watched. The cracks in the earth widened. The mist thickened. And then the ground moved. I felt it before I saw it. A tremor. Deep. Powerful. The kind of vibration you feel in your chest, in your teeth, behind your eyes. The gravestone tilted further, 10 degrees, 20, and the earth around its base began to crumble and fall inward, revealing a darkness beneath that my flashlight beam could not penetrate. Then the hand emerged. I need you to understand that I am not a superstitious man. I have spent 30 years in a graveyard, and in all that time, I never once believed in ghosts. I am a rational person. I read Borges and Tolstoy and Hemingway. I believe in cause and effect, in the physical laws that govern the universe, in the fundamental sanity of reality. The hand that came out of the ground was not sane. It was skeletal, or nearly so. Patches of something clung to the bones, not flesh, not exactly, but a dark, leathery substance that looked like it had been preserved by pressure in time rather than any embalming process. The fingers were impossibly long. Each one was the length of my forearm, tapering to points that were not fingernails but something harder, darker, more like the tips of iron stakes. The hand was the size of a dinner plate. Whatever it belonged to was not, and had never been, human. It came out of the earth slowly. Deliberately. The fingers extended first, spreading wide like the petals of some terrible flower, and then the palm, and then the wrist, if you could call it a wrist, that narrow bridge of dark bone connecting the hand to something deeper, something still hidden beneath the soil. The mist curled around it lovingly, almost reverently, and the hand turned in the air as if tasting the night. Then it grabbed my ankle. The grip was absolute. Not painful, or rather, beyond pain, so intense that my nervous system simply refused to process it and delivered instead a sensation of total, overwhelming cold. The kind of cold that isn't temperature but absence. The absence of warmth, of life, of everything that separates the living from the dead. I screamed. Of course I screamed. I screamed and I pulled and I grabbed at the ground with both hands, trying to wrench my leg free, and the hand held me with the casual, effortless strength of something that had been gathering its power for 150 years. I could feel it pulling. Not hard. Not urgently. Just a steady, patient downward pressure, as if it had all the time in the world, which, I suppose, it did. The earth around my foot began to soften, to yield, and I felt my shoe sink an inch into the dirt, then 2 inches, and I understood with a clarity that transcended terror exactly what was going to happen. It was going to pull me down. Into the ground. Into the dark. Into wherever it had been. My phone. My phone was in my jacket pocket. I don't know how I had the presence of mind, perhaps it wasn't presence of mind at all, but some final, desperate reflex of a brain that knew it was about to die. But I got my phone out and I called the number. The original number, from the letter. The one that had been disconnected for 29 years. It rang once. The static was there. That deep, oceanic roar, like the sound of something vast and incomprehensible trying to fit itself into a telephone line. And beneath it, the breathing. The same breathing. Unchanged. Una ged. That slow, measured rhythm that was older than the phone lines carrying it, older than the electricity powering them, older perhaps than the concept of communication itself. But this time, there was a voice. It came from beneath the static the way a shape emerges from fog gradually, then all at once. It was deep. Impossibly deep. Not a bass voice, not a rumble, it was deep in the way that oceans are deep, in the way that time is deep. It contained registers that human vocal cords cannot produce and human ears are not designed to receive. Hearing it was like having a door opened in a room you didn't know you were in, revealing a space behind it so vast that the room itself, your whole life, your whole understanding of reality, was just a closet. The voice said one word. Run. The hand released me. I don't think it was the voice that made it let go. I think it was the fact that the voice existed at all, that something had responded, that the line I had called was not, as I had assumed, defunct, but had been waiting. Listening. The hand withdrew into the earth the way a startled animal retreats into its burrow, fast and fluid and silent, and the ground closed over it like water closing over a stone. I ran. I ran the way you run in nightmares, graceless, desperate, every step a negotiation with a body that has forgotten how movement works. I ran past the weathered stones and the leaning monuments and the iron gate, and I didn't stop until I reached my car, and I didn't stop then either. I drove. I drove without direction or destination, just away, just anywhere that wasn't there, and I drove until the sun came up and the cemetery was 40 miles behind me and my hands had stopped shaking enough to grip the steering wheel without the car drifting into oncoming traffic. I went home. I locked every door. I turned on every light. I sat at my kitchen table and I waited. The letter arrived at noon. Same envelope. Same wax seal. But the paper inside was different, not cream but gray, the color of the gravestone, and the handwriting was hurried, the meticulous precision of 30 years ago replaced by something urgent, almost frantic. The letters were larger, the lines uneven, as if the writer's hand had been shaking. It read, "Mr. Mercer, we no longer require your services. Your position has been terminated, effective immediately. You will receive a severance payment commensurate with your years of service. Do not return to Greenvale Cemetery. Do not attempt to contact us. Do not speak of what you saw." There was a pause in the text, a gap of blank space, and then, in smaller writing at the bottom, a single line that I have read perhaps 100 times since this morning and that I will carry with me for whatever time I have left: "We are sorry. We thought we had more time." The severance check was on my kitchen counter when I looked up from the letter. I had not heard anyone enter. The doors were locked. The windows were closed. But there it was, a cashier's check for an amount so large that I actually laughed, that unhinged, airless laugh of a person who has passed through terror and come out the other side into something that doesn't have a name. I have not cashed it. I don't know if I will. Here is what I know: something was buried in Greenvale Cemetery in 1872. Something that was not human. Something that someone or some organization, some group, some lineage of people stretching back over a century and a half deemed dangerous enough to require a permanent, living guard. Not a fence. Not a lock. Not a concrete vault. A person. A witness. A pair of human eyes, watching through the dark, for nights a week, for as long as the arrangement could be maintained. Here is what I do not know: what it was. Why it was buried there. Who buried it. What the letters B and R stood for. Who employed me, who paid me, who watched me watching. What the voice on the phone belonged to. Whether the voice and the thing in the ground were the same entity or different ones, the jailer and the prisoner, perhaps, or two aspects of something I lack the framework to comprehend. Here is what I fear: the hand let go. But the ground did not close completely. When I abandoned my post for the first and final time in 30 years, I looked back once, just once, and in the beam of my flashlight I saw the earth still cracked, still breathing, and the gravestone tilted at an angle that meant it would never stand upright again. The thing in the ground is waking up. Or has woken. Or was never truly asleep but was held in place by something, some compact, some agreement, some delicate balance that my presence maintained and my absence has now broken. 30 years. I sat beside that grave for 30 years, and I never knew what I was really doing. I thought I was guarding it from the world. From vandals, from developers, from the slow erosion of neglect. I was wrong. I was guarding the world from it. And now I am not. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if there's a new guardian, if there can be a new guardian, if the arrangement that held for over a century can be remade in time. I don't know if the thing is free now or merely stirring, testing the boundaries of a cage whose warden has fled. I don't know if it matters if whatever is coming was always coming, and I was just a finger in a dam that was going to break regardless. What I know is this: I spent 30 years of my life in the dark, beside a stone, and the dark kept faith with me. It let me sit. It let me read. It let me grow old in its company without demanding anything in return except my presence. Until last night. Until the hand. Sometimes I wonder about the B and the R. I was told not to read the inscription, and I never did, not fully, not deliberately. But I saw those letters every night for 30 years, and I have had all day to think about what they might spell. I've been looking at old records. Newspaper archives from the 1870s. Town histories. Church registries. I found one reference, a single paragraph in a county history published in 1923 to something called the Blackridge internment. No details. Just a date, October 1872, and a location described as the old burying ground on the North Hill, which could be Greenvale. Blackridge. B.R. I don't know what was interred. The history doesn't say. But the paragraph ends with a line that has been repeating in my head like a heartbeat, like that slow, measured breathing on the phone, like the rhythm of the earth rising and falling above something that should have stayed buried, and the elders agreed that it should be watched, for watching was the only surety, and that the watching should not cease for any cause until the end of days or the dissolution of the compact, whichever should come first. The compact has dissolved. I am no longer watching. And something old, something patient, something that has spent 154 years in the dark learning what the dark has to teach is no longer being watched. If you live near a place called Greenvale, or a place that used to be called Greenvale, or a place built on land where a cemetery once stood before the developers came and the stones were moved and the dead were forgotten, pay attention to the ground. Pay attention to the cracks. If the earth starts breathing, you'll know. And you'll know that I'm sorry. I ran. After 30 years, when it mattered most, I ran. But you didn't hear that voice. You didn't feel that hand. You don't know what it's like to have something that old, that strong, that patient, close its fingers around your ankle and pull with the gentle, inexorable certainty of gravity itself. You don't know. But you might. Soon. God forgive me. I ran.